Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We're here together once again, and we're glad you're with us. Wherever you are in the world, we have reason to believe, because we've been told this by our podcast platform, that we have about 60 countries represented every episode when people listen in. So wherever you are, we hope it's going well for you there. But we're here in the U.S. in 3 different locations. And connecting virtually. We see each other's faces, we hear each other's voices. And for this, I'm glad. Anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, and I have written a number of books, and my latest book is entitled In the House of Tom Bombadil. Enough about me. How about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor specializing in the Reformation, also do a lot with medieval. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, Ministry Associated Reflections Ministries, and I run Every Square Inch Ministries on my own.
Okay. Well, going to kick it to you, Tom, and you can give us the topic for the day, too. And I'm going to put my phone on mute because my wife is teaching piano in the background, and people don't need to hear her lesson unless I'm speaking. So here you go, Tom.
All right, I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Just taught a class there on socialist issues and ethics and just graded a bunch of finals. So I won't be talking about any of that today. So I wanted to get into a little bit of a discussion about something we've hit on before, but maybe haven't from this angle, and that's the topic of boredom. I think it's something that a lot of people will analyze as a modern phenomenon. There wasn't quite the same thing as boredom the way we understand it at other times in history. Maybe Glenn can help us with that a bit. There definitely have been some kind of similar, I guess, states, Aidia and, different things that sloth and laziness and other things that we often associate with boredom. But there's a certain kind of pathology, I think, that contemporary boredom supplies culture and is often driven by culture. So kind of unpacking that topic is something I wanted to do today. So with that introduction, anything any of you want to start with before I jump in on boredom?
Well, this is a really boring topic, Tom. What were you thinking? No, actually, I think it's a hugely important topic. And I remember as my children were growing up, they made the mistake of saying I'm bored maybe once or twice, and then I would ridicule them. And essentially my message was, nothing's boring. You may be boring. And the fact that you're bored may indicate that.
Yeah. I've actually, it's interesting that you should bring this up because I've actually been thinking about the issue of boredom this week. And, when I was thinking about it in connection with the kind of focus that people have on having a fun and exciting life. And this connects in with, not wanting to have kids because they'll interfere with your travel plans, that kind of thing. And I was sort of thinking about this in connection with history, in fact. And you need to recognize that in the past, your average person is going to be working on a farm.
Yeah.
And while they may get an opportunity to travel a little bit, maybe go on a pilgrimage or something, mostly they're going to be working on that farm. And they know what they're going to be doing in 10 years. They're going to be working on the farm. And they don't have the expectation that life is going to be fun and exciting. As a matter of fact, they probably don't want it to be exciting because because when it gets exciting, it's hard. It makes things worse for you.
Yeah, I think too that they're surrounded by creatures, farmers. So you're not actually dealing with just like paperwork or sort of a controlled environment in your home. You're actually kind of thinking about how do I make sure that horse doesn't break my leg or kill me. Things, you're occupied with some pretty important matters that you probably should attend to.
Well, there's actually an excellent French film called in English "The Return of Martin Guerre." Great story, but it is the best film I've ever seen at depicting life in that period in the 16th century. What's it like for the average person? And what you find is while the people are sitting around at night, not quote doing their farm work, what are they doing? They're doing something. The father is sitting there carving holes in a block of wood and fitting teeth into it to make a rake. These kinds of things, and it's just what they're doing. They do have time where they're just sitting and talking or listening to music or dancing or whatever. But a lot of their time is just taken up with doing chores, doing things that we don't think of. Who is making the rakes that they're going to use that they need? Well, they're making them themselves. So there's a whole host of things that they're doing, and maybe that keeps them from getting bored. But they don't. The key is, I think, they don't have the expectation that things are going to be fun and exciting all the time.
Well, your comment about music, Glenn, got me thinking about American folk music and how it was so kind of woven into daily life and reflected, and you didn't sit on the porch listening to even the baseball game back in the day. You were just there with your family trying to stay cool after a long, hot day, and the house is probably heat up, and you're just sitting there with your banjo or your guitar or mandolin, and people are just picking and experimenting probably and getting really good, just because there's nothing else to do.
Well, go ahead, Glenn.
And the other thing to remember is that in pretty much every folk tradition around the world, music and dance were part of life. And actually, music was integrated deeply into normal activities. There were, we think of work songs, but there were all kinds of work songs. It wasn't just the people out in the field or working on, hammering spikes into, the railroad or anything like that. There were songs for spinning wool. There were songs for, well, you name it. There were all kinds of things. These were ways that people, kept up in their work, sea shanties, whatever, they kept up in their work. But it was also a way of passing the time in a more interesting way. And it was just something music was just simply part of life in a way it isn't anymore.
And it's that kind of connection that I was thinking about quite a bit. I read an older article by Mike Hamby back in Communio. He wrote an interesting article called "The Culture of Death and the Ontology of Boredom and the Resistance of Joy," which is a great title anyway. And I mean, he gets into a lot of things, that I'll kind of get into a little bit later. But one of the things that is interesting is that he talks about the way in which modern boredom ends up manifesting itself in kind of, a culture that has lost these kinds of being embedded in deeper lives of meaning, if you will. The way in which entertainment still plays a part in it, but it becomes a distraction, not merely to pass time in a meaningful way, like I think you're talking about. Part of the overflow of work life spills over into song, and that song becomes something people build on and commune with, and now it becomes something to distract us from something almost the pointlessness of empty time. And so it's not just passing it the same way. It's really distracting ourselves from the fact that we can't fill it with any kind of much meaning. And the kind of meaning we try to fill it with is just my own interest and my own self flattens out at a certain point. And so you have a big entertainment culture, distracted to death is what some have called it. But music itself plays a very different role in this. You tend to listen to what someone else does rather than learning an instrument and playing it along with people. Now, some people still do, and some people learn by mimicking artists they like. But still, I think it really plays, shows itself as playing a very different function.
Yeah, related to that topic, Tom, I remember reading something about sheet music and its kind of zenith in American life, which was late 19th century, I guess early 20th century, where you had essentially people, in kind of the early industrial era where they maybe had more time, but how they invested that time was not by passively sitting in front of the radio, or because it hadn't really been popularized yet, or it wasn't there, and television definitely not. So many homes had pianos, and they would gather around the piano and sing, and it was just part of life. Maybe mom played, and kids accompanied her, but that was how you finished the day, even though they had maybe more time on their hands than maybe people did maybe even just 50 years before that, because so many conveniences had already come on the scene. There was still a much more, I guess, wholesome way of going about, entertaining yourselves as a family.
Yeah.
The other side of this too is, I mean, this is really kind of a dated reference, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen jokes and things about people sitting in front of a television complaining that there's nothing good to watch and still watching it. As you say, it's a distraction.
Yeah. And it shows, I mean, a whole different way of relating once these sort of technologies that, again, it's not against the technology per se, but the way in which they do rearrange things, and the way in which those rearrangements begin to impact relationships and our relationship to time and space are such that they spill over into pathologies. And one of these that we're talking about is this kind of boredom. And this is why I think, you see the deep need to keep people interested by having these more spectacular big light shows, and I mean Super Bowl type events, a new type of spectacle, as we talked about before, in which you have to keep pushing the experience because the previous one isn't able to do it. And then you see this in similar with churches that chase without alteration this kind of cultural, they're imitating the culture. And so what you have going on there is the church needs to continuously keep the interest of people by having the better show, the better light system, the whatever fashion is going on, or, comedy, if you will. It almost becomes no different than, the society in which it's already located, that is entertainment driven. And that seems to become the distraction away from the fact that the message and the gospel has pretty much become meaningless, even to the church at this point, because it doesn't have the capacity. I think it does have the capacity, but what I'm saying is it has been so dulled, if you will, from its meaning and riches, to the point that we're substituting it, and we're substituting it in the same way the culture is for this kind of death that has happened to meaning.
Yeah, when I think about film, for example, it's I think noteworthy that films, say from the 40s and even the 50s, seem to have a slower pace.
Yeah.
They seem to develop characters better. There seem to be more silence, more sort of visual, connection that they were trying to make with people. In other words, not CGI or lots of explosions, but just scenery, trying to help you to feel like you were maybe on the scene, so to speak.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, that's. And then I remember in the late 70s, I remember Star Wars was sort of a transition point because of its pacing more than anything else. And if you watch the original Star Wars, it almost seems slow. But at the time, it felt like you were being rushed along at a different pace.
The one that really, I think, changes everything is Raiders of the Lost Ark, because the pacing in that is what made Star Wars seem slow.
Yeah.
And that really sort of changed the aesthetic toward these hyperdrive. Well, there's a probably the wrong word to hyper-driven storytelling, where you don't take time to stop and enjoy the scenery or get to know the people or watch them, just live daily life or go through a character arc, in anything but the most overly quick way,
Right.
Yeah, well, you see that in films. I've often gone, to see kind of one of these, modern films with, all the endless explosions and everything left and right, and all the technological, imagination poured into it. But I remember nothing when I leave. I don't remember even the script, if there was a script.
Right.
You forget it very quickly. Whereas, like you said, I can remember, almost lines verbatim from films I watched as a kid and the characters they develop. I mean, think of Clint Eastwood. I mean, there's some classic one-liners in a lot of these, but you remember them and you remember his character, in those scenes. And there aren't takeaways. And I think, again, it's definitely trying to, wow us so much. And you often think, where does that even end up? I mean, there is going to be a stopping point, or if there isn't, that's even more troublesome.
Well, I think for me, there's been a stopping point. I don't have any interest in seeing the latest, I guess, Marvel movie or whatever. And I don't feel like I've missed a thing. Now, the Dune film was interesting for a couple of reasons, because in some small ways it was a recovery of older ways of doing things. But I think the other part of it is you start bored, but now we're at the end of the process and we're bored again. But now it's a sophisticated boredom, whereas that was maybe a naive boredom that we started with, and now it's ennui that we find ourselves in. Like, I've done it all, and what else is there to do? A kind of an Ecclesiastes moment.
Yeah, and I think there's always with any type of, for example, technology and entertainment driven with it, there are always alterations in our relationship even to ourselves. And you think about, we already have the tendency to have a short attention span if it's not at this, hyper driven, continuous flow of impacting us. We get bored and go to the next thing, the next kind of dopamine rush. And again, there's something about us, I know with learning, it's that way. I mean, I want to, you can be reading through a flood of certain works and all of a sudden it's like, well, they get to the point. And, and then you're kind of put that book down and grab another one that, gets to the point and you run with it. So there's already things that impact us about that. But the hard, long process, for example, of reading something and reading it carefully is such a counter image to the way we do things now. And I often feel like, as a teacher with my students, because they can get everything summed up for them quickly online, ChatGPT now thinks for them, reads for them, summarizes things for them. And, that the hard rigors of forming ourselves in ways, I think, that are much richer and bring us back to some kind of embeddedness and meaning, are something we're almost losing the capacity for with this type of thing, at least in the current arrangement of things. And I'm trying to think of areas in which we could tap in that can say, we could actually redirect this to a deeper form of embeddedness and meaning.
Do you remember Robert Pirsig in the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Did you ever read that? That was kind of his. That was kind of his point. And when did that come out? In the 70s.
70s.
And but he was even then concerned about this thing. Of course, he was taking an Eastern approach, but I think the larger concern was still legitimate, no matter where you're coming from. Of a loss of interest in sort of knowing the world through craft and attention and those kinds of things. I remember there was a particular scene he's describing I think it was Pirsig, maybe it was Matthew B. Crawford, but I think it's Pirsig. He was talking about miter joints. He was talking about trimming out a house and what you had to do to make a sort of beautiful miter joint, like a 90 degrees. But of course, you can do it at different, if you're doing different kinds of work at different degrees, but it becomes more complicated or difficult. But to do it right is time consuming, and that's what he was getting at.
Yeah, where I'm going with this is you mentioned acedia.
Yeah.
In acedia is the Latin word that's translated as sloth in the seven deadly sins.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about acedia is that in its original meaning, how it was originally used, what it meant was slacking off in your spiritual duties, your spiritual responsibilities. So it was not being really faithful or engaged in your prayers or in your study or anything along those lines. It's typically a term that was used about monastics who had a rule that they were supposed to follow. And, so if you slacked off in those things, it was considered one of the sins that really imperiled your soul because it said something about how you thought about God and any number of other things. But what you're describing here is a kind of academic acedia, where they are not engaging in the disciplines that they need to do, that they're theoretically committed to doing by even being in the class, that are necessary to get the fruit that is supposed to be produced by those efforts. The understanding, the knowledge, the ability to think, the ability to analyze, the shaping of the mind and the intellect, all of those kinds of things go by the wayside when you're relying on the internet and especially things like ChatGPT. Yeah. It is literally a form of acedia.
Another dimension to that, Glenn, I read a cover story in the latest issue of Touchstone that was discussing kind of the two sides of the Russian character. And, on one side, you have the revolutionary kind of apocalyptic eschatological side, which fed a need for drama and I guess just the thrill, the kind of the adrenaline rush. For example, in the article, the author notes that there were people for whom terror was actually their calling. In other words, to sort of bring about terror in the population, and they lived for it. They got to a place where they couldn't imagine life. So there are written accounts of these people who were terrorists. That was their profession in Russia, in Soviet Russia. They couldn't imagine a life without the thrill of inciting terror. Then on the other side is kind of the small is beautiful school of Russian literature, where Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, these types of folk would say, God is in the details. It's the ordinary things in life where you can perceive the eternal and be enriched thereby. So you have these extremes, and I wonder too about the terrorism that goes on in the academy right now, where you actually have people who get a thrill out of pursuing what they, I think, falsely claim is an academic pursuit. I think it's actually a political program, and they're just using their academic vocation as a platform to actually do something else. So they're not actually interested in scholarship. Yeah. They're not interested in the details of the work. They don't take any pleasure in actually digging out the truth of the past. What they live for is canceling people and shutting down campuses and pursuing their vision of a better world.
Yeah, where academic freedom means the freedom for me to espouse the things that I know are true and the freedom to shut down everybody who disagrees.
It's interesting that this article that I've been working from by Hamby was written right after September 11th, and it's somewhat dated for Hamby, so some of his early analysis as a young scholar on these issues. But one of the things that they're reflecting on up front is how, even though the figures involved in September 11th are, from kind of, the Islamic background, committed to kind of the jihad. The reflection of Hanby and Williams and others at the time said there's something far more complex going on here that is far more Western, and it's more basically homegrown than we'd like to admit. And one of them was the contradictions in the characters, where they would go out to strip clubs the night before and rack up huge expense accounts, and yet have this kind of dramatic theatrical terror. It's similar to, like you were talking about, that extreme in Russia, a similar extreme that is a byproduct also of the West in one of its extreme forms. And as they're reflecting on it, and Hanby, one of the things he wants to do is he kind of notes that, a nihilistic culture of death really explains, helps to unpack a lot of what sets the conditions for postmodernism and these kind of incoherences. But he wants to tap into, on the one hand, we have the side of nihilism that shows that there is this strong desire to assert power on the world, and to erupt, like you're talking about, these academic professors who find meaning not in the nature of things, but, basically playing voluntaristic deities, where they're imposing through erupting, forms of society, forms of social relationships, in order basically to just impose, something meaningful onto them. It's usually their view of what needs to be forced on things. But then he flips it and says, that accounts for one side, but something else is going on here too. And this is where Hamby wants to contribute the boredom factor, is that because we have gutted and we're not embedded, and we are floating and becoming rather than appreciating the goods of being and the gifts of being, and we are placed in this situation where we become either very indifferent, and he talks about in this shows you how dated even this paper was, where he talks about, political passivity for most of culture. Well, now we see it kind of flip, where everyone's politically active, everyone's involved in, imposing this form. And I think this is where I wanted to say that these two seem to be feeding into each other, this kind of apocalyptic drama, doing terror for the spectacle of it, erupting and imposing on the society. But then the other side, how that meaninglessness and almost indifference sets the conditions for needing to kind of make up for it with this other extreme. And I think with the church too, you have this entertainment culture that has no moral vision steeped and embedded in classic Christianity. So it's attractive to the whole woke politicization of everything, because it becomes that meaning, moral meaning structure that it lacks and actually undermines, for that matter.
Yeah, for the good old days of the indifferent stay-at-home voter. I miss those days. They were sane.
Yeah, I've been struck. We're recording this right at about the time when the occupation of various campuses is winding down, largely due to riot police and such. But I'm struck by how much of what's going on is itself, I think, a kind of entertainment. In that the pro-Hamas people who are taking over the campuses and are, all of the horrendous stuff that's going on surrounding that, they're acting out a role. They're in a play.
Yeah.
I don't know how many of them actually believe anything that they're saying or even understand what they're saying.
Yeah.
All you have to do is listen to some of the interviews, and you can tell that they don't know anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, my favorite example is some people from Columbia. A couple of women from Columbia went down to NYU to do a protest there because NYU was doing something, but they weren't sure exactly what it was. And one of them said, "I wish I were better educated." And my response is, "So do I." But I actually, almost by accident, came up with a term for what they're doing. It's cosplay. CAUSE. They're playing at being Hamas. They're playing at being these oppressed people when actually they're from very affluent backgrounds for the most part. And they're in elite colleges. They're doing all of these things as if they are refugees, Gazans, whatever, under attack from Israel. I mean, they're playing roles, and it speaks to both the meaninglessness of their life, so that they're looking for any kind of cause that they can identify with. But I think there's also sort of the entertainment value that I get to play this role, and when I'm done playing this role, I can go back to my normal life.
I wonder, it's a really good observation, Glenn, and it made me think of something maybe for the first time, and that is the Spanish Civil War and the literati who got involved with that, Hemingway and Orwell and so forth, and it was kind of the cause of the moment that people invested themselves in it with, and in a way that we're talking about is a similar class of people. The difference is that they actually had talent, whereas the people we have today don't have much talent.
And some of them actually went to the front lines,
right? And they were doing stuff. Whereas today we have what you brought out, the same ennui, the same bored sort of sated, cosseted existence, but no talent and no real skin in the game. Maybe they think they have skin in the game, and maybe they're getting some scrapes and as they're being removed from the campuses. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, I just don't. Well, there's a similarity, but a big difference at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things you tend to see, especially in a society that sees all kind of relations, what should be natural relations of love, like familial and everything else, have been redefined, basically as just power relations that are, again, meaningless if we haven't assented to them and defined them the way we like them. And so when they find a kind of solidarity in these groups and these movements, they're feeling relationship that's meaningful in many ways, either for the first time or in a delusional sense that it is more real than the natural bonds and the created bonds they have with other things. And I think that psychological dynamic can't be downplayed. I mean, you really see, especially some of the figures that get arrested, if you see the mug, I mean, you really see some unlovable types, and all of a sudden there's a community of unlovable types. And
this reminds me of, I remember Eric Hoffer and the True Believer.
Yeah,
that if people listening to the show haven't heard of Eric Hoffer before, I hope they'll check him out, particularly that book, because he addresses this. He was a really odd guy and a mystery. There's a biography about him that didn't seem to clear anything up. He just sort of appeared on the scene before the Second World War in the United States with a thick German accent. And he lived kind of as a hobo and as a blue-collar kind of day laborer, and eventually ended up being a dock worker in San Francisco. But he was incongruous in the sense that he was brilliant and he was doing manual labor. And he ended up winning a number of literary awards for his writing. But My suspicion is it's because he claimed to have been born in the United States, and I thought, are you kidding me with that accent? but I think he was on the run, and I think he had personal experience with both the Nazis and the communists in Germany before the Nazis came to power, and he had such insight because he had been part of that.
Yeah.
As a young man. That's my suspicion, although he never owned up to it. But you read it and you say, how do you have that appreciation for that frame of mind if you didn't see it firsthand or maybe even experience it yourself?
Yeah, and I think like you're pointing out there, somebody who has either been through it richly, or you begin to see the way in which people huddle, especially certain ages and that have been impacted by a lot of the meaninglessness we've been talking about, and the fact that we cry as human beings out for being embedded the right way in things and having that meaning. I mean, I remember even Francis Schaeffer, he used to call it that irrational leap even to Satanism makes more sense than the senselessness and the despair you end up in if you have nothing to leap to. The kind of Sardian notion that you just have this plethora of beautiful choices before you, which you can actualize and give meaning to yourself, was being felt as hell to people. And so this kind of stuff becomes attractive.
Yeah, well, for Sartre, it was hell. I mean,
Yeah.
remember, I remember reading something. It was a book I've referred to before entitled Daily Rituals, and the author of the book does a vignette about the daily routine of different creatives, everybody from Darwin to Kierkegaard, and he did one on Sartre, and the guy was like drugged out of his mind. Every conscious moment. I mean, he just went from up to down to in between, booze, amphetamines, tobacco. It just never stopped for the guy.
Yeah, all while sitting at the French cafe. One of the things that's fascinating things of his story is just the way he did finally come out and admit that. I think it was when he was a child, he felt the conviction. He literally said of the Holy Spirit, and he threw it off. Well, you kind of to get somebody to even say that, like him, but. How telling where it ends up. But really, it is fascinating to see the way in which that kind of existential dimension became absorbed in this culture that leads to this kind of helps set the conditions for this kind of boredom. Because here you have a plethora of choices that are supposed to be meaningful. And what you find is they don't supply it. So they become like a drug where you have to find one that will for a little bit and will for another. And it's interesting. Back, let me see if I can find the quote. Back probably in the 30s, 40s, when right before the World War, there was a writer, Eric Gill, wrote a book called The Leisure State. And he has this really fascinating read on where things are heading. He says, people won't really love the good things they enjoy in such plenty. There's this many choices before us. They won't love them in the same sense that they will see them and use them as holy things in which and by which God is manifest. So as they're moved from their embeddedness in being sort of sacraments, they start to become, used the way Augustine would say, to find God type of enjoyment in them, but they're unable to deliver. And so we're going to lose the sacredness about them. In reality, they will despise everything. Things will be made only for passing enjoyment, to be scrapped when no longer enjoyable. And so you see with an obsession that things are supposed to become, meaningful in and of themselves rather than just sort of a sacrament of something to be used the right way. We try to exact from them everything, and they won't deliver. And we end up back where we came from, looking to be driven by some other thing that's supposed to captivate us and fulfill us. And I think, again, this entertainment boredom dynamic is one dimension of that. But when that entertainment ceases to satisfy, more dramatic modes, terrorism, political, disruption, eruption, start to really, become another attractive option for that problem.
Well, you can go back to the Roman Empire with this, the entire idea of bread and circuses. People get ugly when they get hungry. If you've got trouble feeding your kids, you're not going to be a happy camper, and you are going to be the kind of person who's likely to cause trouble for the government. So let's keep at least the people of Rome fed. But there's not enough jobs for all of the poor. We've got slaves that are actually doing the work. So we've got all these poor people with no jobs. So we're going to entertain them, and we're going to entertain them with bigger and bigger spectacles. We're going to have these chariot races and teams and all of that, so that you can root for your favorite team and use sports as a sideline. And we'll flood the Colosseum and have mock naval battles there. We'll do the gladiatorial stuff. We'll do all of these different things to keep them entertained. And by the way, we got to keep getting them bigger and better, both for our own reputation and also to keep the people happy. That's what Rome was doing, and they knew they had to distract them, because otherwise they could become a kind of revolutionary force. Rome had to deal with uprisings of poor people in its history. So to avoid that, we're going to distract them and feed them.
Yeah, I remember in Cambridge when I lived there, we had a grocery store called Bread and Circus. It was pretty upscale, and it wasn't for the poor at all. In fact, it was kind of like Whole Foods or something like that. I remember when it first came to Central Square, it replaced an old grocery store that the poor did actually frequent, and that grocery store had Ho-Hos and Wonder Bread and stuff like that, the stuff that those folks wanted. And then when they brought in, this new upscale foodie place, the poor, the people who lived on the street or people who were in the housing projects, were just disgusted, because you'd had to pay like $10 for 7-grain bread. Who wants that anyway? It was kind of fun to watch it all from the ground. Now, another dimension to that is there is something wrong with us, and Augustine gets at this in Confessions, where he's talking about his friend. I can't remember his name. Is it Altheus, who goes to a gladiatorial spectacle and promises he won't look, and then he hears the roar of the crowd, and he opens his eyes, and his soul was captured. Something to that effect. That's how Augustine describes it. So it's true that your account, Glenn, is absolutely right. At the same time, there's still something wrong with us as human beings, that we get sucked into this stuff.
Well, it's actually not much different than pornography when you think about it. Pornography has been getting progressively more and more violent and extreme in a lot of ways. They're really, from what I understand, that the big thing is breaking virtually every taboo that there remains in society. Mm-hmm. And that's because the old style pornography that was around when we were kids is considered tame, almost vanilla stuff now. It just doesn't excite you anymore. You've got to find something bigger and better and more extreme in order to get the same dopamine hit you used to get before. And it's a similar kind of dynamic there. I think, by the way, one of the reasons why you're getting more violent porn has to do with the devaluation of young men in society. And so they're looking for a way to vicariously feel important and powerful. I think that's a contributing factor as well. But be that as it may, it's still essentially, we got to get a bigger and better thing going on so that we can get the same dopamine hit.
Yeah, as I think about the challenges of our time, it seems as though we're at a point where, and I've mentioned this in previous episodes, we're on the cusp of a revival of interest in asceticism. asceticism, which pursues the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of things, that don't, that don't excite these dimensions of our fallen nature, but instead appeal to really other things in us that are suppressed, but now we can no longer ignore because we've essentially sated ourselves. I mean, there's just like, what more can you do? And now the challenge becomes, how do I master the things that mastered me? When I think about the Desert Fathers, I look at them in light of that quest. It's not a quest to earn God's grace or super arrogate to themselves merit or anything like that, but instead kind of get over themselves and be free of the clinging, barbs of fallen and debased culture.
Well, you get that right in Colossians, right? The putting off the old and putting on the new. There's a series of lists that is to be enacted. That's what they're trying to enact, right? These things that were once part of you as part of the earthly fallen world are no longer who you are, so don't act like that. So there's going to be practices that go along with putting that off, and that's where these ascetic practices are placed within the life of sanctification and grace. And I think this is where I think we're spiritually immature, where we sit, because of the impact so much of what I would call a kind of a limited realism, that we've limited the real to such a narrow place, that those aspects of reality from our fuller, richer vision that Lewis is onto and we're always talking about, we use language like sacramental or creation. This is why even when we read the scriptures, our antennas tend to be so narrowed in, and okay, what is the mere ethical principle, or what is the one point? And scripture is talking about a lot of different dimensions of our spiritual life. When you talk about, for example, the visible aspects of creation through which God is clearly seen, the early church and the fathers would know that there is a spiritual seeing through the material that we are unable to see as long as we are still embedded in these kind of vices. And so as we are freed from that, we begin to see more freely and more richly how all things are in God and what that means. So we get a hold of their original meaning, and we get a hold of what we are to do with it. And I think this is why the Christian vision in turn is so imaginative and intellectually fulfilling, is because it is bound up with this life of faith is something that has to do with uprooting me from all of this boredom and self-obsession and freeing me to enter into the fullness of meaning and reality that is just unparalleled. And I think that's really where those fathers, even though we look at them as just like doing extreme things, they were trying to get rid of those extreme things that held us back from a full life of grace.
Yeah. Another thing, though, that is worth paying attention to is then all these lists of things that you're supposed to put off in Colossians or in Romans or wherever, there's always a positive side of it, because you can't replace something with nothing. Mm-hmm. And this is where I actually, rather than going back to the Desert Fathers, I tend to go more to something like the Devotio Moderna of the Brethren of the Common Life in the late 14th and 15th century, where their whole practice, which included ascetic practices, but the intention was very self-consciously to root out the vices in your life and replace them with virtues. And that second half of replacing with virtues, I think, is really, really important, particularly because coming out of a Catholic background, what I had understood as being a holy life was not sinning. And actually, that's part of it, but it's not the most important part. It's what you're doing, not what you're not doing, that's really important here.
Yeah, our friend George Grant is well known for his love for Thomas Chalmers, and Chalmers is known for a little book called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. If I remember, that's the correct title.
Yep.
But that's his whole point, that it's the new love that drives out the old, that something truly lovely in the best sense of that term. Like when we use the term lovely, I think many of us have kind of, I guess, Elizabethan 19th century kind of fluff come to mind, lace and, sequins and stuff like that. But lovely means something that elicits love. It just sort of you can't help but respond to it in the right way. Now, it can include that stuff, but it could also mean other things, maybe even things that on the surface don't seem like they would be compatible with the term lovely. Like when we say a person who's done something heroic, maybe even great personal sacrifice, we'd say that's lovely.
It's interesting. Hanby's reply to the kind of culture of death and ontology of boredom is that the brilliant phrase, the resistance of joy. And he spends a lot of time unpacking that. And it's a very similar thing. He's got this quote here that I think is great. Love and joy is similar to the lovely. By their very act and existence, make a radical ontological affirmation. And I think this is something that, like you said, when you are embedded in that rich Christian vision where you see that, for example, love at the heart of things means there is a reciprocity between two human creatures, for example. And in that reciprocity, received and given the right way, it is fruit-bearing. And this is one of the rich things of the Christian vision is things ordered the right way bear fruit in very good ways. Things that aren't bring all kinds of problem and then ultimately lead to bad fruit, cultures of death. I mean, you see this in a positive reception of the gift of our sexual natures and the proper ordering of them in marriage and procreative dimensions. And you see trying to, erupt that and the damage it does, or resist that and the damage it does, and the like. And I think this is similar to, those richer dimensions, the beauty and good of things. Receive the right way, fruit bearing. Not receive the right way, ensnaring, enslaving, and deadly.
Yeah, when I think about, I'm with you completely, Tom. I've been struggling with how to communicate the significance of being to, say, people who don't think in philosophical ways. If we use the term ontology, which I think is a great word, ontos and all that. People kind of, their eyes glaze over and they stare into the distance and they're not like catching what you're getting at. There's a sense in which I think that's the challenge we face, that the other thing that we're resisting has the appeal of spectacle. I remember listening to P.D. James. You remember P.D. James, the novelist? She was talking about, she was being interviewed, and I remember her reflecting on the challenge that she had depicting good characters, in other words, morally good people, as opposed to the wicked. Her point was, wickedness is really easy to depict. And she said the spectacle of evil, as opposed to goodness being something that is lived out in the sort of the daily round, as you're just kind of interacting with people over the course of the day, in the mundane details of life. Now, occasionally you'll have, moments where goodness can shine, like we see on the cross, or we see with Frodo, bearing the ring or something like that. And there's a lot of drama, but even then, you have to kind of have an appreciation for the inner struggle that the person is not just the surface. You have to have a sense of there's something going on inside this person that I can relate to and I understand and I can admire.
Well, yeah, being and a lot of those kind of what we now are very unfamiliar with culturally, because we are removed by something that, maybe a previous generation would have felt more comfortable with. It's interesting. I was looking at an old logic text by Isaac Watts, who was written for young students, and he delves right into this terminology without defining it. Right from the start. So it is definitely something that is part of a culture that isn't conversant in a lot of that terms. But I think what we are conversant in is being a real being. And what does it mean to be a real being versus to not be? I mean, there's your starting point. When you start to talk about, being an actual reality, well, that actual reality expresses itself in a whole host of ways. And those expressions say something about that actual reality, right? There's a continuity between what we are and what we do. It's not always consistent, but it definitely spells out when you see a continuous pattern, something true about us that we enact. And so being has to do with all those aspects of what we are all the way down. So what is a human being? What distinguishes the real human from the not real human? Now, it's not always easy to unpack that or get a holistic description, something that covers everything. But there are things about us that distinguish us. Otherwise, we're unintelligible and we can't talk about what a human being is and distinguish it about anything. And there are other beings. There's something intelligible about them, the way that they manifest themselves and enact themselves, that allow us to talk about them. And so, for example, when we start to say there is no real difference between the being of a cat and the human being, that's just all social construct. Well, first of all, it doesn't, if it makes any intelligible sense to make a distinction even there, then there's something that distinguishes them, right? And so being is intelligible and it is distinguishable because it is real. And that reality manifests itself in very real ways. That's not always easy to get a hold of, but when you start to mark those distinguishing characteristics about things, that's when you're starting to unpack how different kinds of beings can be referred to and recognized. So when we were talking about love and joy, by their very reality, the fact that they are here, they are telling us something when they enact themselves in the world. That reality somehow has love and joy in it that is more intelligible when that has a ground in something loving and joyous than the fact that it isn't. I mean, these are the sort of claims we're talking about.
Yeah, let me try to summarize what I think might be a takeaway, and you can correct it or modify it or develop it or whatever. But what I'm hearing you say, Tom, is that really what boredom seems to be due to is a lack of real connection to the real.
Yeah.
That if you're really connected to the real, then you just can't help but be engaged, and boredom is not like possible. If does that sound right?
Yeah, it sounds right. And what happens is when we get bored, because we're more and more removed from those real reality, is we have to bake simulations of reality, and those substitutes are what we're attracted to because we are removed from our connectedness to the real. So the more unreal we become, the more fascinated by things that are unreal.
I actually want to go to Ecclesiastes here, because if you read, Solomon sounds like a guy who's really bored. He's tried everything. Nothing, it's all vanity. Nothing really is there. But what does he say? Several times through the book, he talks about how it's good for you to do your work and take joy in it. And what we see happening now is artificial work. This is one of the reasons why at the beginning, when we were talking about Chat GPS and Aidia, it's because it is removing work. And one thing we know from the garden is that God gave us work to do there. We are meant to be doing work. It can be physical work. It can be intellectual work. We're tending the garden or we're naming animals.
Yeah.
You know, it can be a variety of different things, but whatever is our calling, we are to work hard in it. And if we do that, there's no guarantee we won't get bored occasionally, but if we find our delight in our work and in the wife of our youth and all of those kinds of things, I think that is God's response in many ways to secular boredom.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Glenn, and a good place to stop.
Perfect.
Yeah. So finishing with Solomon and Ecclesiastes and the subject of boredom, that's apropos. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. We're not going to talk about our Indiegogo campaign, but because by the time this show comes out, I think we're going to be in the UK. And so pray for us, if you would. We're probably running around from place to place and setting up equipment and driving on the wrong side of the road and trying to make sure we don't hurt ourselves as we do that and all that kind of stuff. But if you would like to support our ongoing work, that's much appreciated. And we have a Patreon page where we have a number of dedicated supporters who pay the bills every month. And if you'd like to join them and pay the bills, well, it's important. The bills need to get paid if there's going to be a show. And there's a link in the show notes, and we encourage you to go there and check it out. You can become, there basically every option is a form of pug. And so if you want to become a pugster in the grumble, that's the place to do it. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.